Hello and welcome everyone to yet another video. It is SwiftUI from scratch episode 7, and in this one we will learn together how to handle a big variety of user input and create a form to get the data. For full code from this video and every other, check out our GitHub profile in the description. It also involves free exercises for you to practice SwiftUI. Enjoy the video and let's get started. There are a lot of predefined SwiftUI views to gather data from the users, such as strings, numbers, colors, dates, or more. One thing to notice is that every single variable that will hold an information about the user will be an addState variable, since the user can change its value during runtime. The first one to show is a simple text field view where a user can fill out the text field with any desired string. You will simply type text field and you can see that it needs two parameters. First one is a title key, so we will for example say username, and the second one expects a binding string, so we have to introduce a new property, so state private var username, and we will set it to an empty string by default. Now we can fill out the text parameter and resume our preview. Let's now hit the live preview, and when you click inside of the text field, you can write anything on your keyboard, and this is changing the value of the state property username. The other one we will use is called a secure field, and it is very similar to the text field. It also expects an addState string. The only difference is that the data inside the secure field are not visible during the runtime for the user which is typing the string, so it is usually good for things like passwords and some private information. Let's try using the secure field now, so we will use a vstack and put a secure field down below, and you can see it is almost exactly the same thing. So we will name this password, and we also need a binding string property. So I will copy this and simply rename this to password, and it will be empty by default as well. And we will put $password and resume our view. You can see on the screen that it looks exactly the same, but with the username you can actually see the input. But with the secure field there will be only some kind of dots, as you might be familiar with using passwords on other websites or applications. We will not worry about the styling too much at the moment. The only thing we will do is insert some padding onto the vstack, so the views will be more visible to us. And another pre-made view we will introduce is a date picker, which is a very great pre-made SwiftUI view for the user to input some kind of a date. It also needs its titles, so we will say pick your birth date, for example. And we also need another binding property, but this time with the type of being a date. So we will say birth date, and we have to initialize it. So we will say date with the braces, and this function returns the current date with the current time. Let's now insert the birth date property and resume the view. As you can see, we now get our date picker. So if you, for example, tap on this, you will get this great calendar view, so you can select some days. So for example, February 21, 17th. You can also switch the years and the months right here. And you can also select your desired time. So let's say 10:46 p.m. for example. The problem with the picker is that there aren't any boundaries in what can a user pick. So for example, in the years, you can go to, I don't know, 1861, and this will be fine. However, there aren't any people who are alive in 2021 who were born in 1861, obviously. So you would want ideally to put some boundaries, so the minimum and maybe the maximum of what can be chosen inside the date picker. For this, you can use another parameter inside the date picker and say that the selection is in a range, and you can, for example, say from today's date to whatever. So if you resume right now and try picking a date, you can see you cannot go into the past right now. The same thing would be putting it from whatever to date, and now you cannot pick anything in the future. We would ideally want two variables so we can make some kind of a range. So for example, we say in our app, we only want people in an age range from 15 to 120 years old or whatever. So for this, we would ideally want to introduce two new variables. For this, we will say let max age, and this will be equal to a calendar class, a current, and for this you will use this function right here, which, as you can see, returns a new date, which represents the date calculated by adding an amount of a specific component, and a component can be a year, month, an hour, seconds, or even nanoseconds to a given date. So what we want to do is say at a year, and for this we want to do minus 120, I will explain in a second, and add it to today's date. So what is happening right here? The date function is returning the current date, so right now, and we're adding minus 120 in years to this. This means that this will be the lowest boundary for the date which can be picked inside our picker. So people who are in theory 121 years old will not be able to pick their actual birth date. We will do the same exact thing with the other boundary. So we'll say that the minimal age inside our application are people who are 15 years old. Now what you can do is modify the range. So we will say from max age to min age. We will get an error now that says that the value of optional type date must be unwrapped to the value of type date. We will not cover optionals in this video. We will cover this later on in future episodes, so please don't worry about it right now. You can research this if you want, but we will simply fix the problem by using the exclamation mark and forcing the unwrap on both of these variables. Now let's hit the resume on our preview, and as you can see, the max age in our app is 120 years. So this will be 1901 will be the maximum. So if we go really down here, we can see that we can pick 1901, but we cannot pick 1900 because these people would be 121 years old. And it's exactly the same with the other boundary. So you can say that people in 2006 are 15 years old. However, the people who were born in 2007 are not 15 yet, they are 14. So this will not let you pick any kind of date outside of this range. The last parameter for the date picker before we move to another one are actually the components you want to display inside the picker. So now we are displaying the date and also a time, but there are use cases such as the birth date where you only want one of those, because most likely you don't care at what time the person was born, you only care about the actual date. So you can specify this by using the displayed components argument, and by default this is a date and an hour and a minute. So now it will not change, but for this we only want the date, so you can remove the array now since it is only one thing, and you will only get the date displayed. Same thing with the hour and a minute, so now you only get the time display instead. Another important one is a slider view. So you will simply say slider, and you need some value inside it, which is going to be an binding CG float. So we will need another property for this. So we will, for example, say that we want to get an information about the person's height, and it will be a type of a CG float, and we will say it will be 150 by default, for example. Now you will insert the height and resume the preview again. As you can see, you will get this slider which you can drag and change the value of the property. However, we want to display the value of the height property. So under that, we will say that text and use our height property for it to be displayed. As you can see by default, when we move the toggle on the slider, it only goes from 0 all the way to 1, although we've set it to be 150 by default. For this, we need to specify the range once again. So we will say in, and let's say 120 to 220 centimeters maybe. And now you can see that we go from 220 all the way down to 120. As you can see, whenever you're switching the value of the property, it can actually be a floating point number with a very big precision. So in this case, you probably only want to know that the person in this case is 164 centimeters tall, and you don't care about the numbers that are in the right side of the floating point. What you can do here is to put another argument which specifies a step. So meaning each time you move the toggle, it will increment or decrement by 1. So 150, 146, and so on. So it is only a whole number right now. The last thing we will do is to get rid of the numbers after the floating point on the right side, because we don't need this information. We don't need the additional zeros to show up on the screen. What you can do is to use a conversion and convert the CG float to an integer, so it will only show the whole number. And after this, you can put centimeters, for example, and now the user can pick the height. Another control which is widely used is the toggle control, which basically only toggles between true or false. So let's see how this works. It has an isOn parameter which expects a state boolean value. So another one will be state private var, And what will you be doing a lot inside your application is to put a switch where the user can agree to the terms of use of the application. So we'll say agreed to terms and set it to false by default. Now we can bind the value right here, and in the curly braces we want to put some kind of a content. So we will say a text agree to terms. Now after reloading the preview, you can see that we got our text and this little switch, which you can also see in other apps such as the setting app inside your Apple device. So you can switch this. If I switch this, the property is set to true, and if I switch it back, it's switched back to false again. Another useful one is a picker view. So whenever you got a multiple option for the user to pick from, you will use the picker view. So let's try writing picker and hitting enter. And as you can see, it needs some title as well. So we will care about the coding skills of our user, for example. And we need some binding variable again. So let's say that this will be a string, a word. So we will say that the option by default will be beginner, right? So you will bind this variable again, erase the content like this, and use the curly braces instead. And what you can do now is to put multiple options right here, perhaps inside text views, for the user to pick. So we will say intermediate, advanced, and pro, for example. And now you will get a multiple selection for your user. He can pick whatever inside this kind of a wheel spinning view. A better way to do this is to actually introduce an array of the available options. So we will say let options and basically have these values inside the array. So we will say beginner is one, intermediate is the second one, then we have advanced, and then we have pro. So we're basically copying what we had right here. And instead of this, we can now use a for each loop, which is very much more convenient than this. So we'll say for each inside our options array, use the identifier for each element inside of the array, and access it using the option variable inside this closure. Option in. And now you can say text option, and this will have the exact same result, but you will use this 100% of the time. The picker itself can either look like this spinning wheel right here, or you can use a modifier on the picker to change its view directly. So you will say picker style, and this one is called segmented picker style, and use the initializer. And as you can see, it's no longer the wheel view, but this segmented picker. Another user input based view, which is available in SwiftUI since 2.0 version, is a text editor. So basically when the input is a longer string, some kind of a description maybe, then you will have to use the text editor, because the text field or the secure field is mostly used for shorter words, not for longer texts. So we will simply use text editor right here, and it is basically the same as with the text field. So we've now introduced another state variable, which is called description, and it's empty string by default. And inside the text parameter, we will use the description. And as you can see, nothing appears on the screen. That's because you actually have to specify the frame of the text editor in order for it to show. So we will say width 300 and height 200, for example. Now, if you tap inside this one, you can actually write some text. Let's make it more visible and set the description variable to some text by default. So we will say write a description, for example, and resume. And now you can see that by default it says write a description. If you try tapping on it, the annoying thing is that you actually have to remove this text and start writing your text. I have a trick for you to resolve this problem. What you can do on the text editor, you can introduce an on-tap gesture. So whenever the user taps inside the frame of the text editor, we will say that the description text is equal to an empty string. So by default, it is write a description. If I tap inside of it, it will be blank and the user can start typing right now. Another thing we can do is to introduce a border to this so we can actually see it on the blank white canvas. So we will say border, color black, for example, and the width would be 1 pixel. Now you can see the actual frame of the text editor. So again, when we tap inside of it, the description is set to an empty string and the user can start typing whatever he likes. Let's now try using the stepper view, which is kind of similar to the slider view, but the design is slightly different. So we will say stepper, and the value, again, some kind of a state variable. So we will say state private var hours, for example, and set it to 3 by default. We will care how many hours the user programs each day. So we will bind this to hours again, and again you can set some range. So we will say from 0 to 24 hours a day. And the question now will be how many times a day you code. And as you can see, how many times a day you code, and you can hit this plus and minus button right here. However, you cannot actually see the value being changed. So inside the text view, we will display it once again. So how many times a day you code, and after this we will say the hours property. So by default it is set to 3, and I can increment it and decrement it by 1. So it goes from 0 all the way to 24, which is the upper boundary we've set inside the range. The last one we will cover inside of this video is the ColorPicker, which is my personal favorite by far, and it has also been introduced to SwiftUI since the version 2.0. So what you can do is write the ColorPicker, and inside this again some titles. So choose your color, and we need a binding color inside the selection. So let's copy this right now, and we will say color. It will be a type of a color, and you have to set its default value as well, so it will be black by default. Now let's bind the property and say color. As you can see, our view appeared on the screen. We have choose your color right here and this little icon. So when you tap on this view will show up, which is a very well made pre-made view inside of SwiftUI. So you can either choose inside the grid of the colors, you have your color spectrum as well, you can adjust the opacity for each color, And also you have an RGB slider right here, so a lot of ways you can pick the right color you want. Also, if you pick one color by this plus button, you can save it to your favorites for later on. And after you pick the color, you change the property, which is called color for us, to this purple. You can see that it also changed inside the circle. The way to use the color you've chosen inside your color picker is very simple. You can use it inside any modifier you would like. So we can, for example, change the foreground color of the whole VStack to our color variable. I've resumed it once again, so you can see that the foreground color is black by default, so it seems like nothing happened. But let's pick our color again. Let's choose our purple, which we've saved before. And when I go back, you can see the foreground color of the whole VStack is actually set to our purple. I can use whatever color I want, and the property inside the foreground color modifier will change automatically since it is a state property. That will be all of the controls I wanted to show you inside the video. But now let's take a look at a form view. So what we will do now is, instead of having this VStack, the only thing we will do is to rewrite it to a form keyword. As you can see, we get a very big change on our screen. Let's erase our padding that we had on our VStack earlier on in the video. And as you can see now, we get a very clean pre-made form view, and the elements are aligned differently. We got some corner radius inside it, and it overall looks much better than before. The downside to this is that the elements inside the form are not that customizable as they would be inside the VStack, because there are some pre-made protocols for the form. So for example, you cannot change the corner radius to whatever you like. Long story short, there are some pre-made things that you cannot change at all. However, when using some kind of a form, when you're asking people to give you some data about themselves, this might be a very useful thing to do, to embed all of these elements inside the form view. Another advantage while using the form view is that we can put the separate views inside sections to separate them from each other. So let's say that the username and a password would be one section, so we will simply write a section and a curly braces and put these two elements inside the section. As you can see, you get this little line break which separates all these sections inside the form view. So let's maybe do the same thing with all of those so you can see how this looks. So we will get another section for our date. Let's say that we want a text here and which says pick your height, and we want all of those to be in a section as well, so we will put these three elements inside the section. And as you can see, the form is starting to look a lot more nicer, a lot more clean, and a lot more readable for the user perhaps. So let us use another section right here on the agreed on the terms toggle. This would be a separate line maybe as well, and another section for the picker with the text editor where the user describes maybe his coding skills, and we can leave the rest how it is. So that is a very nice thing, that you can use the section view inside the form view. A very cool thing about the sections is that each section can have its own separate header. So in the braces, in the section, you can specify a header which expects any kind of a view. So for example, a text view, and we can say login info for this. And as you can see, it also has some pre-made style. However, you can use modifiers on this however you like, since this is a view, so maybe change it to red. And also, it doesn't only have to be one view. You can perhaps specify an H stack and put multiple views as the header. So let's say that we want an H stack and an image from the system name library, and there is one called person.circle.fill, if I remember correctly. And after this, we can have the text login data or whatever we had earlier, I can remember. So it can actually be any type of the view for the header, and you can specify each header separately for each section. So that is a very cool thing for the form view as well. Alright, this has been a very quick overview of the controls inside the form, how you can get the user data using all kinds of user input controls inside of SwiftUI. Do not worry, we will take a look deeper into this in a future episode where we will be building actual application with register forms, where we will be customizing the forms however we like. We will be redesigning the forms and also validating the user input data in the future. Alright everyone, this has been episode number 7 of SwiftUI from scratch. Thank you very much for watching once again, staying with me. Hopefully you've learned something new today. And also, if you're interested in the full code from today, also with free exercises for you to practice SwiftUI by yourself, check out the link in the description to our GitHub profile. Also, there is currently a 100 subscribers giveaway on my channel for a $50 Apple gift card. So if you're interested in that, the link will be down in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching again, and make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes. See you soon.